A hand shoved hard against a pregnant woman's shoulder. She staggered backward through a screen door and hit the gravel. A tin plate of food flipped into the dirt beside her. She threw both arms around her belly and curled forward, trying to protect what she carried. A man filled the doorway behind her, red-faced, still yelling about $2. Then a dog came out of nowhere. Low to the ground, teeth bared, it planted itself between the woman and the man and would not move. The whole parking lot went still. Nobody stepped in. Nobody said a word. Her name was Maribel Ontiveros, 7 months along, a soldier's widow, and she had just been thrown out of a bar over pocket change. But 3 men in the back had been watching the whole time. What they did next left that room dead silent. Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back a few minutes to before any of that happened. The Rusty Spur Saloon sat off the highway a few miles north of Flagstaff. It was the kind of place truckers stopped at because there was nothing else for 30 miles. A gravel lot that turned to soup when it rained. The man who owned it liked it rough, and he'd built it that way on purpose. Dale Crocker had run the Spur for 11 years. He was a big man gone soft in the middle, loud in the way that men get loud when nobody has ever once told them no. He kept a baseball bat behind the register that he called the manager. He liked to say the Spur was the last honest bar in the county. What he really meant was that inside those 4 walls he could do whatever he pleased. And for 11 years he had. There was a story in town about a college kid who complained about a cold plate, and Dale had followed him out to the parking lot to make sure he understood how things worked. Nobody complained twice at the Spur. That was the whole point of the place, if you asked Dale. Maribel Ontiveros walked in a little after 2 in the afternoon. She was small, dark-haired, 26 years old, and 7 months along. She moved slow, one hand always resting on the curve of her belly. Behind her, out on the porch, a dog waited, a blue heeler, gray and white speckled coat, one ear up and one ear down, old scars across his muzzle. His name was Scout. He didn't come inside. He sat right where she told him to sit, and he watched the door, and he didn't take his eyes off it. Now, here's what you need to know about Maribel. 5 months back, 2 soldiers in dress uniforms had come up the walk of her little rented house east of town. She'd known before they knocked. Everybody knows before they knock. Her husband, Tomas, was gone. He'd been a mechanic and a good man, and he'd left behind a truck that didn't run, a stack of bills, and a dog that used to sleep at the foot of their bed. That dog would not leave her side now. Scout followed her to the mailbox. Scout followed her to church. And when the money ran thin, which was most days, Scout followed her wherever she had to go to stretch it. The month since the funeral had been a slow arithmetic of loss. First, the phone got shut off. Then the good coat went to a neighbor for grocery money. She'd learned to eat 1 real meal a day and call the rest of it not being hungry. And she'd learned to count every dollar twice before she spent it, because a mistake of $2 was not a small thing in a life run that close to the bone. She had counted out her cash in the truck before she came in. She knew exactly what she had. She ordered the cheapest hot plate on the board because she hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days, and the baby was making that impossible to ignore. She ate slow. She was polite to the waitress, an older woman named Faye who'd worked the Spur since before Crocker owned it. Faye had taken one look at the dress that had been let out at the seams and the careful way this girl folded her hands, and she'd quietly brought an extra roll and not put it on the check. When the check came, Maribel laid her money on the table and started to count it into Faye's hand. And that's when she came up short. $2. The plate was priced different than the board out front, and there was a tax she hadn't figured, and when she added it all up her stomach dropped because she'd already eaten it. It was already gone. She started to apologize. She said she'd come back tomorrow with the $2. She said she'd leave her name, her address, anything they wanted. Faye, God bless her, waved a hand and said, "Don't worry about it, honey, I'll cover it myself." And that would have been the end of it. But Dale Crocker had been watching from behind the register, and Dale didn't like being told there was a problem somebody else had already solved. Because to a man like Dale, a solved problem was a missed chance to be the biggest man in the room. He came out from behind the bar. He asked, loud enough for everybody to hear, what the holdup was. Faye said it was handled. Dale said it wasn't handled because he hadn't handled it. And then he looked down at this small, pregnant woman sitting at his table, and something in him decided she was going to be the afternoon's entertainment. Now, at that hour the Spur was near empty. A couple truckers at the bar. Faye. And back in the corner, in the shadow past the pool table, 3 men in worn leather cuts were nursing warm beers and saying nothing at all. You already know who they were. But right then, they were just 3 quiet men in the back that nobody was paying attention to. And that, believe me, is exactly how they liked it. Dale started in on her. He asked if she thought his place was a charity. He asked if she thought she could just waltz in and eat his food and stiff him. He got louder with every word because every word landed and nobody stopped him, and that's fuel to a man like that. He picked the plate up off the table and held it up so the truckers could see it, and asked them if this looked like a free lunch. The truckers looked into their beers. Maribel kept her voice small. She kept apologizing. She reached for the money again to prove she'd meant to pay, and her hand was shaking. She got out 3 of the $4 she still had and pushed them across the table and said she'd bring the last of it in the morning. She swore she would. That's when it turned. And this is where it turns for real. Dale Crocker reached down and grabbed her by the arm and pulled her up out of the chair. Faye said his name sharp like a warning. He didn't hear it. He marched Maribel toward the front door with a hand on her shoulder, telling the whole room that this was what happened to people who tried to cheat him. She stumbled once trying to keep up, and he didn't slow down, and at the door he gave her a shove. That shove is where the story started, out through the screen door, onto the gravel. The plate she'd carried out to scrape into the trash for Faye went flying into the dirt, and Maribel Ontiveros, 7 months pregnant, went down hard on her hip in both hands, curling around her belly on instinct, taking the fall everywhere but there. And that's when Scout moved. The old dog came off that porch like something 10 years younger. He put himself between Maribel and the doorway, low and coiled, lips peeled back off his teeth, and out of his chest came a sound that stopped Dale Crocker cold with one boot still on the threshold. It wasn't a bark. It was lower than that. It was the sound a dog makes when it has already decided. Dale froze. The gravel lot went dead quiet. Faye had both hands over her mouth in the doorway. The truckers had turned on their stools and were looking anywhere but at the pregnant woman on the ground. Nobody moved to help her up. Nobody said one word. In a bar full of grown men, a 14-year-old dog with gray on his muzzle was the only one who'd stepped between her and the man who'd knocked her down. Dale's face went from red to a mean kind of white, because now there was a problem he couldn't just yell at. He looked at the dog. He looked back over his shoulder into the bar, toward the register, toward where the manager leaned against the wall. And you could see the thought cross his face plain as day. He was going to go get the bat. And then from the shadows in the back of the bar, a bottle came down soft against a table. Not a slam, just a click of glass on wood, deliberate in a room gone so silent that it landed like a gunshot. One of the 3 quiet men had stood up. He was tall, not gym tall, working tall, the kind of size that comes from 20 years of picking up things other men can't. Gray in his beard, grease worked so deep into his knuckles it would never come out, a leather cut on his back with a winged patch and the word Flagstaff stitched at the bottom. He didn't rush. He crossed that floor slow, boots loud on the boards, and every eye in the place followed him. The other 2 rose behind him and stayed by the pool table, arms folded, just there. His name was Hank Malley, but nobody had called him Hank in 20 years. They called him Deacon, road captain of the local chapter, and the story was he'd earned the name burying more brothers than any man should have to. He walked past Marable without stepping over her careful, and he put himself in the doorway so Dale Crocker couldn't go back inside for that bat. He looked down at the woman in the dirt. He looked at the old dog still growling, still holding, and something moved behind his eyes. Then he looked at Dale Crocker, and in a voice you had to lean in to hear, he asked one question. "How much," Deacon said, "does a man owe a soldier's widow?" Dale didn't understand it. You could see he didn't understand it. He said something about $2, about his bar, about how it wasn't any of theirs. Deacon just kept looking at him, patient, the way you look at something you've already decided how to handle. Now here's the thing you have to understand about the Hells Angels, and about the men who wore that patch back in 1979, whatever else the papers said about them. There was a code underneath it. It didn't always show. But it was real, and it was old, and at the center of it was this. You do not touch a woman, and you do not touch a child, and you sure as hell do not put your hands on both at once and then reach for a bat. These three had ridden in off the highway for a cold beer and a game of pool. But a man doesn't get to pick the day the code asks something of him. It picks him. Deacon reached into his cut and pulled out a battered leather wallet. And this is the moment. This is where the payoff starts, so if you're still with me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one about ordinary people getting their dignity back are exactly what this channel is here for. Now let me get right back to it. Deacon opened that wallet in front of the whole bar. But he didn't hand Dale $2. He didn't hand him 20. He counted out bills onto the porch rail one at a time, slow, and he kept counting, and Dale's face changed with every one. 100, then 200, 3. He laid the money out like he was building something, and then he set the whole stack under an empty beer bottle so the wind wouldn't take it. "That's for the meal," Deacon said, "and every meal she wants for the rest of the summer. She eats here whenever she's hungry. She eats first and she eats free, and Faye keeps the change." He turned his head a few degrees. "Faye, that work for you?" Faye, crying now, nodded. Dale started to bluster, started to say he didn't take orders in his own bar. And that's when the nature of it all changed, and Dale finally felt it in his gut. Because Deacon leaned in close and dropped his voice down to where only Dale could hear it, and whatever he said drained every ounce of color out of that man's face. Then he straightened up and said it loud for the room. "You put your hands on her," Deacon said, "in front of witnesses, in front of me, and you were walking back inside for that bat behind your register. I watched you decide it." He let that sit. "So here's how the rest of your afternoon goes." He crouched down easy next to Marable and held out one grease-stained hand, palm up, and waited. He didn't grab her. He waited until she reached back. Scout stopped growling the second she did, like the dog understood something the men had taken longer to figure out. Deacon helped her to her feet slow, one hand under her arm, the other flat and careful against her back, and he asked her if anything hurt, if the fall had reached the baby. She said no. She said she'd taken it on her hip. He nodded like a man filing that away and told the second biker, a young one they called Pockets, to go warm up the truck and drive careful, because she wasn't leaving that lot on her own after a fall like that. Then he turned back to Dale Crocker, and the payoff came down. "You're going to apologize to her," Deacon said. "Not to me, to her. Out loud so Faye hears it, so those two at the bar hear it. And then every man in this county who rides is going to know exactly what kind of place the Rusty Spur is. What kind of man runs it. We stop here every week. We spend money here every week. You do the math on that, Dale, because I already have." Dale Crocker stood in his own doorway with $300 sitting under a bottle on his porch rail and a whole bar watching him. And for the first time in 11 years, the biggest man in the room was the smallest thing in it. He looked at the truckers. They looked at the floor. He looked at Faye. She looked right back and didn't blink. There was no one left to be loud for. He turned to Marable. His jaw worked. And in a voice like gravel going down a drain, he said he was sorry. Deacon shook his head. "Look at her when you do it." And Dale did. He lifted his eyes to this small woman with dirt on her dress and one hand on her belly, and he said it again, quieter, and this time it meant something, because it cost him everything to say it. Marable just nodded. She didn't gloat. She didn't have it in her to gloat. She just said thank you, soft, and the strangest thing was she said it to Dale, not to Deacon, like she was giving the man a way to walk out of the worst thing he'd ever done and maybe not stay there. The third biker, the oldest of the three, a heavy man they called Bear, had gone down on one knee in the gravel. Not to Marable, to the dog. He held out the back of his hand and old Scout sniffed it, and after a long moment the dog's tail moved once, side to side. Bear ran a palm over that gray muzzle and looked up and said, to nobody in particular, "This dog did what a room full of men wouldn't." And nobody in that room could answer him, because it was true. They loaded Marable into the club's truck to follow her home and make sure she got there. Scout jumped up into the cab beside her without being asked and settled his chin on her knee. And as they pulled out of that muddy lot, Deacon stopped at the driver's window of Dale's own truck, where the man was standing alone, and said one last thing low that we'll get to, because it mattered later. It mattered more than any of them knew right then. Now you might think that's the end of it. A good deed, some money on a porch rail, a humbled man, but it wasn't the end. It was the middle, because a thing like that doesn't just close up quiet and disappear. They drove Marable home slow, and Deacon rode in the bed of the truck the whole way with the wind in his gray beard, watching the road behind them. When they got to the little rented house east of town, Bear looked at the truck in the yard that didn't run, and the porch step that had rotted through, and the way the screen door hung off one hinge, and he didn't say anything. He just took a slow walk around the place with his hands in his pockets, the way a man does when he's making a list. Marable tried to thank them again at the door. She tried to say it was too much, the money, all of it. Deacon stopped her. He said, "Ma'am, we didn't do you a favor today. We paid a debt. There's a difference, and someday I'll tell you what it is." And then the three of them got on their bikes, which Pockets had ridden over behind the truck, and they rumbled off down the dirt road, and the dust hung in the air a long time after they were gone. And for a few days, that was that. Marable ate. The baby settled. She slept better than she had in months. She caught herself humming in the kitchen one morning and stopped, surprised, because she hadn't heard that sound out of her own mouth since before the uniforms came up the walk. The false quiet of a good thing having happened. Then that Saturday she woke up to the sound of engines. Not one, not three, a dozen, then 2 dozen. A river of them coming up her dirt road in the early morning, the whole Flagstaff chapter and half of 2 more, and behind the bikes came a flatbed trailer, and on the flatbed was a used but running pickup, blue, the same color Tomas used to drive. They'd heard about the dead truck in the yard. They'd passed a hat, and a chapter of men the whole town crossed the street to avoid had bought a soldier's widow a truck that ran. But that's not what shattered the quiet. Here's what did. Deacon climbed off his bike and walked up to her porch, and he wasn't smiling. He had a folded newspaper in his hand, and he laid it on the rail, and it changed everything from a story about a good deed into something with teeth. Because Dale Crocker hadn't taken it lying down. The paper was the local weekly, and there on the front page was a story Dale had gone and planted with a reporter he drank with. The headline said a biker gang had menaced and extorted a Flagstaff business owner, forcing money from him under threat. There was Dale's photo, looking wounded. There was a quote from him saying he feared for his life, and that he'd reported the incident to the county sheriff. And down at the bottom was a line that turned Marable's blood to ice water. It said the club had been seen coercing a local woman, and that the sheriff was looking into whether the woman was involved. You understand what that meant. It wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't even about Dale. Dale had reached past all three of those bikers and grabbed the one thing they couldn't fight with fists or money. He'd reached for the law, and he'd wrapped Marable up in it. A pregnant widow dragged into a criminal story, her name about to be printed under the word coercion, in a small town where a woman's name was the only thing she had left. In a town like that, a printed word didn't wash out. Dale knew it. That was why he'd chosen it. He'd found the one wound that fists couldn't answer. Deacon looked at her and said, "Quiet, he can't hurt us. We've been called worse in bigger papers. But he named you. And that means the sheriff's going to come to your door and ask you questions. And however you answer, the whole county's going to talk. So I'm not going to tell you what to say. I'm going to ask you what you want to do." And for the first time since her husband died, somebody had put Marable Ontiveros back in charge of her own life. She stood on her porch a long time. She looked at the blue truck on the flatbed. She looked at the newspaper with her honor in it. She looked at the 24 men standing in her yard waiting, not one of them telling her what she owed them. She looked at Scout, sitting at her feet, one ear up and one ear down. And she made a decision that surprised all of them. She said, "Take me to the sheriff. Not you, me. I'll drive myself in my new truck, and I'll bring the dog." Now here's where it all came down. The county sheriff was a lean, tired man named Ed Pruitt who'd been elected 4 times and had exactly no patience left for Dale Crocker, who he'd known and disliked for 20 years. But a complaint was a complaint, and the word gang made the state boys twitchy, so he'd had no choice but to open a file. He'd figured on driving out to the club and leaning on somebody, and he'd figured wrong about how the day would go. Because he was sitting with that file when the door of his office opened, and a very pregnant woman walked in with an old blue heeler at her heel and sat down across from him without being asked. Marable told him everything. She didn't leave out a word. She told him about the $2. She told him about the shove and the plate in the dirt and the fall on her hip and Faye offering to cover it and Dale reaching for the bat. She told him a dog was the only one who stood up for her, and then 3 men in leather did what the whole bar wouldn't. She told him about the money on the porch rail, and that not $1 of it had been taken from Dale, that it had been given to her, and that she still had most of it, and she laid it on the desk to prove it. And she told him that a man who would shove a pregnant woman into the gravel over $2 and then run to a reporter to call her a criminal was not a man the county needed to be protecting. Then she did the thing that ended it. She stood up slow and turned her hip toward the window where the light was good and showed the sheriff the bruise. It had come up over the days since, deep and wide and ugly, exactly the shape of a fall, exactly where she'd said she'd landed. And Ed Pruitt, 4-time sheriff, father of 3 daughters, looked at that bruise on a 7-month pregnant widow and closed the file with one hand. He drove out to the rusty spur himself that afternoon. He took Faye's statement, and the 2 truckers had left their names with the club, so he took theirs too, and every single one of them said the same thing because it was the truth. Ed Pruitt walked into Dale Crocker's bar and told him in front of his own customers that if he ever heard the word extortion out of his mouth again, he'd charge him with filing a false report and with assault on a pregnant woman, and that he had the bruise and the witnesses to make both stick. Then he told him to print a retraction in that same weekly paper, word for word, or spend the fall explaining himself to a judge. The retraction ran the next Friday. Front page. It named Marable only to clear her, and it called what happened at the spur what it was. Now let me tell you what Deacon had said at Dale's truck window that first day, the thing that mattered later. He hadn't threatened him. That was the surprise of it. He'd leaned in and said, "I had a sister. She married wrong, and there was a bar once and a man like you and no one stood up. She didn't make it out of that year, so I'm not going to hurt you, Dale. I'm going to make you watch that woman do just fine for a long time right here in your town. That's the debt. It was never yours to pay, it's mine. And then he'd walked away. That was the debt he'd been talking about all along. Maribel had her baby that September, a girl, healthy, loud, 7 pounds even. She named her Anna after her mother, and she gave her the middle name Hank, because she said any man who spent his whole life paying a debt that big deserved to have somebody named after him who never had to know why. Deacon cried when she told him. Big man, gray beard, greased knuckles, cried right there on the porch and didn't try to hide it. The chapter fixed the porch step and rehung the screen door and got the old truck running to sell for parts. Bear came by most Sundays with a bag of groceries he swore he'd bought by accident, and he'd sit on the step and throw a tennis ball for Scout until the old dog got tired, which took longer than you'd think. Faye quit the Spur that winter and went to work at a diner in town that treated her right, and she never once regretted it. And Dale Crocker, well, Dale sold the rusty Spur 2 years later and moved on, and by most accounts he was a quieter man after that summer, though whether that was shame or just age, nobody could say. But there were people who swore that near the end of his time there on slow afternoons, if a stranger down on their luck came in short a couple dollars for a plate, Dale would wave it off and tell them not to worry about it. Nobody ever thanked him because nobody knew the story. But he knew, and maybe that was the point. Scout lived 2 more years. He was there for Anna's first steps, which she took holding onto his back, both hands full of gray fur, and he stood so still and so patient the whole time that Maribel had to sit down on the floor and cry. When he finally went, he went in his sleep at the foot of her bed, in the exact spot he'd claimed the day Tomas came home from the service and never gave up. The whole chapter came to bury him. 24 grown men in leather cuts, standing in a yard, hats off, for a dog. And that, in the end, is the whole of it. A woman got knocked into the dirt over $2, and nobody in a room full of men would stand up for her. Nobody but an old dog with a gray muzzle, and 3 quiet men in the back who remembered a code the world had mostly forgotten. It started with a hand on a shoulder and a plate in the gravel. And it ended with a little girl named Anna learning to walk with both hands wrapped in the fur of the only one who ever stood his ground. The angels always said they weren't the good guys. Maybe they weren't. But that summer, outside Flagstaff, they were the only ones who did the good thing. And believe me, the whole bar stayed dead silent, because deep down, every man in it knew it should have been them.